What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. All around the world, we've seen central governments, in coordination with their central banks, engaging in a plan to try and erode the burden of the increasing debt load. But just as a snake cannot stay alive by eating itself by its own tail, neither can governments achieve prosperity through spending that is financed by borrowing and printing. And now more than ever, we're seeing a catch-22 show up for every dollar governments spend, where they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Ready? Let's dive in. At this point, there's no debate whether there's inflation or not. Now the debate is basically just about how long the inflation will last. And as a result of this recent rise in prices, we are starting to see the fatal flaw in the Keynesian economics approach to getting yourselves out of economic trouble from a central planner's or central government, central bank standpoint. So first, what is this plan? Basically, you start off with a government who one year decides we want to spend more money than we're bringing in taxes. The only way to spend in excess of what you're bringing in income is to borrow the difference. So the government goes into a little bit of a debt and has a deficit. Well, as this continues for years and decades on end, eventually you get to the point where that debt burden is pretty heavy, because not only does a government have to continue paying its expenses, but it also has to pay off any maturing debt plus the interest on all of the debt that it has. Just like you, for your normal budget, you have to pay your expenses, you have to buy your groceries, and you also have to make your debt payments plus interest, like your mortgage. Same with the government. Now, at this point, governments continue to have two options to increase their income. You increase taxes or you increase borrowing. It's the only way to increase your income. Either way, you are pulling money out of the economy. You're either pulling it from savers who want to lend to you, or you're pulling it from workers, employees, from capital, from wealth in the form of taxes. And every once in a while, then you get to a point like we saw back in September of 2019, when the central government basically pulls all of the money out of the economy that it can and taps the economy out. This is when we saw the repo market explode in 2019, and the Federal Reserve had to step in and do not QE. Essentially, at this point, once the central government has tapped out the economy and pulled everything out that it can without causing a major collapse, the only choice then is for the central bank to start working with the central government to fund its deficits. Now, there's a problem with this, because in most countries, the central bank cannot just print money directly and deposit it with the central government, and then the central government gets to spend it. In fact, in most countries, the central bank can't even lend directly to the central government so that they have that money to spend. In most cases, the central government is only allowed to borrow from the private sector. In the United States, it's just like this. And so when the central bank is the fallback plan for the central government's financing, they have to go through some legal loopholes. Essentially, what happens is the central bank starts to create money, and they go and buy that government debt out from the private sector. This injects newly created money into the economy, as financial institutions like banks get to sell those treasuries, sell that federal government debt to the central bank, and they get cash for it instead. What they then do is they turn around, they take that new cash they just got, and they loan that money to the central government. They turn back around, sell that debt off to the Federal Reserve or the central bank, swap it for cash, and they repeat this process until the central government has gotten enough income to satisfy its needs at the interest rates that it needs. It's indirect and it's inefficient, but it gets the job done of providing the central government with the cash that it needs, at least temporarily. Now, here's where the problems start to show up. The central government needs to lighten its debt burden, because it can't rely on central bank monetary expansion to fund its deficits forever. Otherwise, you risk hyperinflation, because running large deficits that are funded by the central bank is a continuous expansion of the money supply. And at some point, that trips over, in resulting in a loss in faith in the currency, a collapse in purchasing power, and hyperinflation. And so governments know that at some point you need to solve your debt burden, because you can't rely on printing forever. So they came up with a genius plan. The plan is to use inflation to lighten the debt burden. And on the surface, this makes sense. Just for rough numbers, so that it's easy to wrap your head around what they're trying to do here. If you are the central government and you look out at everybody in your country, you see employees, you see companies, you see people that hold wealth. If you double everybody's income, and then you double everybody's wealth, essentially, you're going to roughly double your tax revenue. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, because it's going to change some behaviors. The spending patterns are not going to be identical to scale, but essentially you're going to drastically increase your income as a central government from taxes if you drastically increase the national income and you drastically increase the national wealth. Now, key to remember here, this is all nominal. This is just in straight number of dollars. Obviously, if you just doubled everyone right away, what that would do is essentially result in the numbers of wages changing and the numbers associated with stock prices changing and the numbers associated with wealth changing, but essentially nobody's lives would actually change. Everybody would be exactly as wealthy as they were before because it's all relative. But there is a wealth transfer from creditors to debtors in that circumstance, because if you double the wealth and you double the income and you double your tax revenue as a result, all of a sudden, you've drastically increased the amount of income, but you still have the same fixed payments on your debt. You still have the same fixed number of dollars that you owe. And so your debt burden, the pain of paying that debt, drastically decreases because you've increased your income due to inflation. So that's the plan, and that's what most central governments and central banks have been doing in an attempt to lighten the debt burden. And keep in mind, this has an added benefit of eroding the debt of anybody who has debt that is fixed interest rate debt. Corporations and individuals alike have their incomes increased as inflation goes up, which makes paying off the old debt burden, which is nominally set in stone, makes it easier to pay that off. So problem solved, right? Not so fast. Take a look at this recent article that just came out right in time by CNBC talking about the coming hike to Social Security payments, probably going to be the biggest in years for 2022. And this is a direct result of the inflation numbers for 2021 being some of the highest in years. Because as inflation goes up, the cost of living goes up. And so built into things like Social Security, there are cost of living adjustments. Now, Social Security is a big one, but it represents a much larger pool of general obligations that the central government, the federal government has that are increased with inflation. Altogether, U.S. obligations total anywhere between 500 and 1,000% of US GDP. Now, this is important. It is vital because these numbers are not fixed. These costs go up when the cost of living goes up, when inflation goes up, especially things like healthcare goods and services. So as the government runs large deficits that are financed by the central bank expanding the total supply of money, it increases the total supply of money in the system. That bleeds over into prices, pushing prices up. Yes, that results in higher income for the central government through taxes, but it also pushes up their expenses through massively ballooning obligations. And keep in mind that these obligations are far bigger than the US national debt is. Currently in the United States, the national debt is about 130% of GDP, which historically is just not a good number. But we're not going to talk about that right now because 130% is a heck of a lot better than 500 to 1,000%, which is obligations. And that 130%, which is the debt to GDP, represents something that the central bank can print and that is fixed. The number of dollars and the number of dollars included in the total interest payments is set on that existing debt. The obligations, on the other hand, are currently sitting at about 500 to 1,000%, which is 3 to 7 times higher than the national debt, and they're not fixed. They actually increase with inflation. So this plan is very similar to a snake that is trying to feed itself by eating its own tail. The government is trying to lighten its debt burden by spending money into the economy that it doesn't have, that it's not pulling out of the economy first. It is being financed by the central bank, so it's expanding the broad money supply. That increases total prices across the system, which does increase the federal government's income. But at the same time, at an even faster rate, it's increasing the central government's expenses. Now, the likelihood that the federal government defaults on any of its obligations in nominal terms is basically almost zero. Yes, Social Security payments are going to go up because of inflation. And yes, there's a lot of problems with Social Security. Essentially, the way that it's legally designed makes it difficult to fund, but essentially all it takes is one stroke of the pen by Congress in order to rectify that, and it will just become a general expense. When push comes to shove, they'll do that. So in nominal terms, default is almost certainly not going to happen. And if you want to see more on that, check out this video. But in terms of purchasing power, the default is already happening every day, especially for things like Social Security. Now, it's unknowable how long this can go on, but the ROI that the central government is getting on running these large fiscal deficits that are financed by the central bank, monetary expansion, it's already negative, meaning it alleviates the pain right now, but long term, it grows the expenses from those obligations even more. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.